January 15th, 1944. Portsmouth, England. General Omar Bradley stood on a rain-swept dock watching British sailors wrestle with something that looked like a massive steel box 6 stories tall, hollow, floating. He'd been briefed on Operation Overlord for months. He'd studied maps, read reports, attended endless planning sessions. Nothing had prepared him for this. Behind him, his aide shifted nervously. These weren't ships. They weren't even landing craft. They were concrete harbors, artificial harbors, that the British planned to tow across the English Channel and sink into place off the Normandy coast. Bradley watched another one slide into the gray water, impossibly massive, impossibly ambitious. What he said in the next 60 seconds would reveal everything about the gap between American confidence and British desperation, between those who'd fought alone and those who just arrived. The Americans had come to save Europe. That's what they believed. That's what the newsreels back home proclaimed. Fresh troops, unlimited resources, industrial might that made German factories look like workshops. By January 1944, over 1 million American soldiers were in Britain, more arriving every week. They brought optimism, swagger, certainty that the war would be won through American firepower and American courage. The British had been fighting for 4 years. 4 years of retreat and defeat. Dunkirk, Norway, Greece, Crete, Singapore, Tobruk. 1,000 smaller disasters that never made American headlines. They'd stood alone after France fell, endured the Blitz, watched their cities burn, sent convoys into U-boat-infested waters, knowing half wouldn't return. They'd learned to count the cost of every decision in British lives, British ships, British blood. By the time the Americans arrived, Britain had been bled nearly white. This difference between American hope and British hard-won knowledge shaped everything about the invasion planning. General Dwight Eisenhower arrived in London as Supreme Commander in January 1944. His job, coordinate the largest amphibious invasion in history. His challenge, blend American optimism with British caution, American aggression with British experience, American resources with British exhaustion. The first meetings revealed the gap immediately. We'll land on the beaches, establish a beachhead, and push inland, American planners said, pointing at maps of Normandy. Straight through to Berlin. British planners listened with the patience of people who'd heard bold predictions before, who'd watched them dissolve under actual combat. They didn't argue. They just asked questions. Quiet questions that revealed problems the Americans hadn't considered. We'll bring them through the ports. Which ports? Cherbourg is heavily defended. It could take weeks to capture, months to repair if the Germans demolish it, which they will. Silence then. Maps studied more carefully. The problem becoming clear. An army in France would need 7,000 tons of supplies every day. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, spare parts, replacements for everything the Germans would destroy. Without ports, without harbors, without protected waters where ships could unload safely, the invasion would strangle on its own supply lines. The army would push inland, run out of ammunition, and die. The British proposed a solution so audacious it seemed impossible. They would build harbors. Not capture them, build them. Construct massive artificial harbors in Britain, tow them across the Channel, sink them into place off the Normandy beaches. Create protected anchorages where ships could unload regardless of tides, regardless of whether any French ports survived. The harbors would be called mulberries. Each one would be the size of Dover Harbor. Each would handle more cargo than any natural port on the French coast. When British engineers first presented this plan to American commanders, the reaction was predictable. General Bradley studied the drawings, his face carefully neutral. Concrete caissons, each weighing 6,000 tons. Steel breakwaters called bombardons. Sunken ships called gooseberries. Pierheads that rose and fell with 30-foot tides. floating roadways extending 2 miles from shore. The entire structure would require 200,000 tons of steel, and concrete would employ 15,000 workers. Would need to be built in absolute secrecy, then somehow towed across one of the world's most dangerous waterways and assembled under German fire. "This is what you're counting on?" Bradley asked finally, not hostile, but not convinced. "Floating concrete boxes?" The British engineer, a quiet man named Bruce White, who'd spent 3 years developing the design, didn't flinch. "We're counting on mathematics, sir. Steel-reinforced concrete, proper buoyancy calculations, and the fact that we have no other choice. The Germans control every port within 200 miles of our landing zones. Either these work or the invasion fails. There's no third option." That was the British way now, in 1944. Not hope, but necessity. Not confidence, but calculation. Not optimism, but the cold assessment of what must work, because failure meant defeat. The Americans started paying closer attention. By March 1944, American generals were touring British invasion preparations across southern England. What they found challenged every assumption they'd brought from America. General George Patton arrived at the Mulberry construction sites near Stokes Bay expecting to see British efficiency, the parade ground precision he remembered from visiting British units before the war. Instead, he found organized chaos. Shipyards working 24 hours a day. Concrete being poured faster than it could cure. Caissons sliding into water while workers were still welding sections together. The smell of cordite and paint and diesel fuel. The sound of hammers and welding torches and shouting. The sight of structures so massive they seemed to defy physics. A British colonel gave him the tour, shouting over the noise. "Each caisson is 300 feet long, 60 feet wide, 60 feet tall. We're building 146 of them. When they're towed into position, we'll flood them, and they'll sink to the seabed, creating a breakwater 5 miles long. Behind that, ships can unload in calm water, even in a storm." Patton watched a caisson being launched. 6,000 tons of concrete sliding into Portsmouth Harbor, displacing water in a wave that rocked boats a half-mile away. The structure floated barely. Concrete and steel shouldn't float, but there it was, riding low in the water like an industrial iceberg. "What if it doesn't work?" Patton asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious. The colonel looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had watched too many friends die, that carried 4 years of accumulated grief and exhaustion. "Then we try something else, sir. We always do." That phrase, "we always do," stuck with Patton. Later he would write about it, about the difference between American confidence and British endurance. Americans believed they would win. The British knew they had to keep fighting regardless of whether they won. It produced different approaches to impossible problems. General Omar Bradley had a different revelation, visiting the tank modification yards near Southampton. The British were doing something the Americans considered unnecessary, even wasteful. They were taking perfectly good Sherman tanks and attaching enormous contraptions to them, flails for clearing mines, fascines for crossing trenches, bridges that could be laid mechanically, flamethrowers, demolition charges. Each modification reduced the tank's combat effectiveness, made it slower, more vulnerable, less capable of straight-up fighting. Why? Bradley asked the British tank commander showing him around. "These tanks were designed to fight other tanks. That's an American perspective, sir. We've tried landing on defended beaches before. Dieppe in 1942. We lost over 3,000 men in 9 hours. The Germans had pillboxes covering every approach, mines everywhere, obstacles in the water and on the sand. Brave men in standard tanks couldn't reach them, couldn't even get off the beach. So we decided, modify the tanks for the specific job of getting off a defended beach. Once we're inland, we'll bring the regular Shermans. But first we have to survive the first hour." Bradley watched a Sherman with a flail attachment rotating chains that detonated mines clear a test field. Slow, ungainly, strange-looking, but effective. Ruthlessly effective. The British had learned something the Americans hadn't yet grasped. Courage wasn't enough. Will wasn't enough. You needed specific solutions to specific problems, even if those solutions looked absurd to people who hadn't faced those problems. By April, American generals were attending full-scale invasion rehearsals off the Devon coast. Exercise Tiger, they called it. A complete dress rehearsal with live ammunition, actual landing craft, troops hitting beaches under simulated German fire. The British insisted on realism, actual explosives, actual casualties expected, actual conditions as close to D-Day as possible. General G. Lawton Collins watched from a command ship as the first wave went in. Landing craft circling offshore, organizing into lines, heading toward the beach. The noise was overwhelming: ship guns firing, aircraft overhead, explosions on the beach, the diesel roar of hundreds of landing craft engines. Exactly what it would sound like when they did this for real. Then it went wrong. German E-boats, fast attack craft, appeared from nowhere. They'd somehow learned about the exercise, slipped past the escorts, and launched torpedoes into the convoy. 2 LST's landing ship, tank were hit. The first exploded, a fireball visible for miles. The second burned, men jumping into water still wearing their combat gear, drowning before rescue boats could reach them. By morning, over 700 American soldiers were dead, killed during a training exercise on the English coast, 50 miles from the nearest German. The British called off the exercise immediately, rescued survivors, recovered bodies. The American commanders were stunned, angry, looking for someone to blame. A British admiral met with them that afternoon. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the man who'd organized the Dunkirk evacuation, who'd spent 4 years planning how to put an army ashore on a hostile coast. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "the Germans just taught you something it took us 3 years to learn. The enemy gets a vote. No matter how well you plan, no matter how many ships you bring, no matter how brave your men are, the enemy will do something you didn't expect, and men will die. The question isn't whether we'll lose ships, lose men, face disasters we didn't plan for. The question is whether we'll adapt fast enough to keep going." The room was silent. Outside, bodies were still being pulled from the cold English Channel. Collins spoke first. "How many times have you done this? Planned amphibious assaults? Since 1940? Dozens. Small raids, large raids, deception operations. We've landed in Madagascar, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, dozens of Norwegian coastal raids. Everyone taught us something, usually something we paid for in blood. And D-Day?" Ramsay looked at the maps covering the walls, at the thousands of ships marked on them, at the beaches where 150,000 men would land in a single day. D-Day will be the largest, most complex military operation in human history. We'll do everything right, and things will still go wrong. Ships will sink. Units will land in the wrong places. Communications will fail. Men will die on beaches we thought were clear. And we'll have to keep going anyway, because stopping means defeat. The American generals left that meeting different men than when they'd entered. By May 1944, the Americans understood something that changed their entire perspective on the invasion. The British weren't preparing to win. They were preparing not to lose. Every backup plan had a backup plan. Every critical system had redundancy built in. The Mulberry harbors came in pairs to complete artificial ports, so if one failed, the other might succeed. The specialized tanks weren't elegant, but there were dozens of varieties, each solving a specific problem. The supply calculations assumed disaster ships sunk, equipment lost, units destroyed, and still included enough surplus to keep going. General Eisenhower saw it most clearly during final planning sessions at Southwick House. British and American officers working 18-hour days, reviewing every detail, every contingency, every possible failure point. A British brigadier was presenting the plan for clearing beach obstacles. Millions of metal and concrete barriers the Germans had placed in the tidal zone. Hedgehogs, Belgian gates, tetrahedra, each designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. The plan required combat engineers to land first, under fire, and blow paths through the obstacles before the main assault waves arrived. Expected casualties in the first wave? Eisenhower asked. 70%, sir. The room went quiet. 70% meant these men were being sent to almost certain death. They knew it. The planners knew it. Everyone knew it. But without cleared paths, the entire invasion would fail before it started. An American colonel objected. That's not acceptable. We need to find another way. The British brigadier's response was gentle, but firm. There is no other way, sir. The obstacles are there. The invasion must proceed. Therefore, men must clear the obstacles, even though most will die doing it. We've calculated the minimum number needed to clear enough paths. We've identified volunteers who understand the mission. This isn't what we want. It's what's necessary. Eisenhower realized then what the British had been trying to tell him for months. War wasn't about finding solutions where everyone survived. War was about calculating acceptable losses, identifying which sacrifices would save the most lives overall, and ordering men to die, knowing it was necessary. The British had been making these calculations for 4 years. Every convoy sent into U-boat waters, knowing some wouldn't return. Every bombing raid over Germany knowing hundreds of crews would die. Every defense of Malta, of Tobruk, of every position they'd held against impossible odds. They'd learned to think in probabilities and acceptable casualties, because thinking in certainties led to paralysis. But this created a different problem, one that emerged during final equipment inspections. American troops were arriving in Britain, carrying confidence that British troops had lost. The Americans believed in their training, their equipment, their inevitable victory. British soldiers had learned skepticism toward official claims, toward optimistic predictions, toward anything that sounded too good to be true. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, noticed it during joint exercises. His paratroopers would jump into a zone, expecting to land together and move as units. British airborne troops jumped expecting to be scattered, separated, lost. The Americans planned for success. The British planned for chaos. Your men seem pessimistic, Taylor mentioned to a British airborne colonel. Our men are realistic, sir. We jumped into Sicily last year. Pilots got lost, dropped us miles from our zones, some over water. Men drowned, units scattered. We spent the first day just trying to find each other. So now we train every man to fight alone if necessary, to complete his mission even if every other member of his unit is killed or captured. We call it aggressive pessimism. Expect the worst, plan for the worst, but fight like you expect to win anyway. This was the British contribution Americans struggled to accept. Relentless preparation for disaster, coupled with absolute determination to keep fighting through that disaster. It seemed contradictory. How could you prepare for catastrophic failure while still planning to succeed? The answer came from a source Taylor didn't expect: Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister visited American units in May, giving speeches, boosting morale, showing solidarity between allies. Taylor attended one of these visits, watching Churchill address troops who would soon jump into Normandy behind German lines. Churchill didn't give them false hope, didn't promise easy victory or certain success. Instead, he told them the truth. Some of you will not return from this mission. That is the mathematical certainty of war. But those who do return will have participated in the great crusade of our age, the liberation of Europe from tyranny. Your courage will matter. Your sacrifice will matter. Not because victory is guaranteed, but because fighting for freedom is worth the cost, even when victory isn't certain. After the speech, Taylor asked Churchill privately, "How do you maintain morale while being so blunt about casualties?" Churchill lit a cigar considering his answer carefully. "General, we learned something during the Blitz. When you lie to people about how bad things are, when you promise them easy victory and safe returns, you train them to collapse when reality hits. But when you tell them the truth, yes, this will be hard. Yes, some will die. Yes, we might fail, you give them the chance to choose courage, despite knowing the cost. That choice, made freely with full knowledge, creates a resilience that false optimism never can." Taylor thought about this as D-Day approached, about the difference between confidence and resilience, between optimism and determination, between American hope and British endurance. By June 1st, with the invasion 5 days away, American generals had stopped questioning British preparations and started learning from them. The floating harbors no longer seemed absurd. They seemed like exactly the kind of audacious engineering required for an impossible task. The specialized tanks no longer seemed wasteful. They seemed like the difference between a bloodbath and a victory. The redundant planning, the backup systems, the careful calculation of acceptable losses, all of it made sense once you understood what the British had learned through 4 years of hard fighting. General Bradley wrote in his diary on June 2nd, "The British have taught us that success in war doesn't come from never making mistakes. It comes from building systems that survive mistakes, from planning so thoroughly that when disaster strikes, and it will, you can adapt and keep moving forward." They've turned pessimism into a weapon. June 6, 1944, 0630 hours. General Bradley stood on the bridge of USS Augusta, watching the Normandy coast through binoculars as the first waves hit Omaha Beach. It was chaos. Exactly the chaos the British had predicted. Landing craft sinking from German fire. Tanks drowning in deep water. Units landing in wrong sectors. Communications failing. The beach covered in obstacles that should have been cleared but weren't. Men pinned down behind the shingle, unable to advance, unable to retreat, dying in the surf. Everything that could go wrong seemed to be going wrong. The specialized British tanks, the funnies, American troops had mocked during training, were clearing paths through minefields, bridging ditches, laying tracks across soft sand. The ones that survived were saving hundreds of lives. The backup plans kicked in. Units landed in wrong positions adapted, fought toward their objectives anyway. Engineers who weren't killed clearing obstacles kept working, kept lowering gaps, kept creating paths forward. The redundant supply system meant that when one beach bogged down, others could increase their loads. By afternoon, the Americans were pushing inland from Omaha and Utah beaches. Not smoothly, not according to plan, but forward, always forward. 6 miles offshore, the British were beginning to tow the Mulberry harbors into position. Massive concrete caissons moving toward France at 3 knots, barely faster than a walking pace, surrounded by small boats and tugs, the most ambitious engineering project attempted under combat conditions. German artillery was already finding the range. Some caissons were hit, damaged, kept coming anyway. Bradley watched through binoculars as the first caissons were maneuvered into position and flooded. They settled onto the seabed exactly where the British engineers had calculated, creating the first sections of an artificial harbor that would eventually handle more cargo than any port in France. His aide, the same officer who'd been with him in Portsmouth, 5 months earlier watching these structures being built, stood beside him. "They're actually doing it, sir. The crazy British bastards are actually doing it." Bradley lowered his binoculars. Around them, ships were unloading supplies. Medics were treating wounded. Engineers were building up beach defenses. The organized chaos of an invasion that should have failed but hadn't, that had absorbed disaster after disaster and kept going anyway. "They tried to tell us," Bradley said quietly. "They tried to explain that this was how it would be, messy, bloody, improvised, nothing going according to plan, but succeeding anyway. We didn't believe them because we'd never failed badly enough to learn those lessons." By June 12th, both Mulberry harbors were operational. 7,000 tons of supplies flowing across their piers every day, exactly as the British had calculated. The beachhead was expanding, armies pushing inland, the great liberation of Europe underway. And in meetings between American and British commanders, the tone had changed. Americans no longer brought easy optimism to planning sessions. They brought the same careful calculation, the same redundant planning, the same aggressive pessimism that prepared for disaster while fighting for victory. General George Patton, preparing for his breakout from Normandy that would carry Third Army across France, met with British General Bernard Montgomery in July. Patton had spent months criticizing British caution, British slowness, British pessimism. Now he needed advice on logistics, on how to keep an army supplied during a rapid advance across hostile territory. Montgomery gave it to him straight. Assume everything will break. Your trucks will break down. Your supply lines will be cut. Your communications will fail. Your fuel will run out. Plan as if all of that will happen simultaneously, because some of it will. Then plan how to keep advancing anyway. Patton took notes. Later, during Third Army's spectacular dash across France, when fuel ran out and supply lines stretched to breaking point, when everything Montgomery predicted came true, Patton's forces adapted. Not smoothly, not easily, but they kept moving because they planned for those failures. The invasion of Normandy cost over 4,000 Allied lives on D-Day alone. Tens of thousands more in the weeks that followed. The Mulberry Harbors, those floating concrete structures that seemed so impossible in January, handled over 2 million tons of supplies before one was destroyed in a June storm, and the other became the primary Allied port for months. The specialized tanks saved thousands of lives, clearing obstacles under fire. The backup plans, the redundant systems, the careful calculation of acceptable losses, all of it proved necessary. American generals who arrived in Britain, confident that American methods would win the war, learned something more valuable. They learned that success in war comes from realistic planning, from preparing for disaster, from building systems that survive contact with the enemy and keep functioning even when everything goes wrong. They learned that courage isn't enough without calculation, that optimism isn't enough without preparation, that confidence isn't enough without the humility to learn from those who already paid the price of experience. In December 1944, General Eisenhower met with his senior commanders at Versailles to discuss the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces had broken through American lines, created chaos, threatened the entire Allied position in Belgium. American units were surrounded, communications disrupted, supply lines cut. Everything was going wrong simultaneously. Bradley suggested immediate retreat to consolidate forces. Patton proposed an aggressive counterattack. Montgomery recommended careful preparation and overwhelming force. But it was Eisenhower who made the decision that revealed how much he'd learned from the British. We hold the flanks, we absorb the attack, we let them overextend, and we cut them off. It will be bloody. We'll lose men and equipment. But we've planned for this kind of disaster. We have reserves positioned, we have supply systems that can adapt, and we've learned to keep fighting even when things look impossible. The plan worked. Not elegantly, not smoothly, but it worked because Allied forces had learned to function through chaos, to adapt to disaster, to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. Later, historians analyzing D-Day and the Normandy campaign would focus on the beaches, on the fighting, on the breakthrough. They would calculate casualties and count divisions and map the advance across France. But the real story, the one that determined success or failure, happened before the first shot was fired. It happened in the planning rooms and construction yards of southern England, where American generals learned that winning wars required more than courage and confidence. It required the hard wisdom earned through years of defeat and endurance, the ability to prepare for catastrophe while fighting for victory, the discipline to calculate costs while maintaining the will to pay them. An American colonel, asked in 1991 what he remembered about D-Day preparations, paused before answering. "We came to Britain thinking we'd teach the British how to win. Instead, they taught us how to survive losing, how to take a disaster and turn it into a setback, how to plan for everything to go wrong and still accomplish the mission." The British didn't save D-Day with their engineering or their specialized tanks or their artificial harbors. They saved it by teaching us that war isn't about perfect execution. It's about having enough redundancy, enough backup plans, enough determination that when things fall apart, and they always fall apart, you can adapt and keep going. He looked out at the rebuilt world, at the peaceful Europe that had been purchased with so much blood and preparation. We learned to respect British pessimism because we finally understood it wasn't pessimism at all. It was realism earned through loss. And realism, in war, is the only thing that keeps hope alive. The concrete caissons of the Mulberry Harbor still rest on the seabed off Normandy. Massive structures, visible at low tide, testament to audacious engineering and desperate necessity. American tourists visit them sometimes, marvel at their size, take photographs. Few understand what they really represent, not just British ingenuity, but British endurance. The ability to look at an impossible problem and solve it through calculation and determination rather than hope. The wisdom to prepare for disaster while fighting for victory. The generals who planned D-Day are all gone now. But what they learned about preparation, about resilience, about the difference between confidence and competence echoes through every military operation since. The U.S. military's emphasis on redundancy, on backup systems, on planning for failure, all trace back to those months in 1944 when American generals watched British preparations and learned that survival in war requires more than courage. It requires the humility to learn from those who've already paid the price of experience, the discipline to prepare for catastrophe, and the determination to keep fighting even when everything goes wrong. The British taught the Americans these lessons not through speeches or training manuals, but through example through floating concrete harbors and specialized tanks and careful calculations of acceptable loss. And when the invasion came, when everything went wrong exactly as the British predicted, the Americans were ready. Not perfectly ready, not ready in a way that prevented loss or suffering, but ready in the way that mattered most. Ready to adapt, ready to survive disaster, ready to keep moving forward no matter what hell they found on those beaches. That readiness, more than any single weapon or strategy, won the war.